On deafness and its characteristics. Deafness or hearing loss happens when one or more parts of the ear aren't working effectively. The ear has two main functions. It receives sound and converts it into signals that the brain can understand, and it helps us to balance. Most deaf children can hear some sounds at certain frequencies and loudness, and with the use of hearing aids or implants, they are often able to hear more sounds. But this is not the same for all deaf children. Two types of deafness. Sensory neutral deafness, or nerve deafness, is a hearing loss in the inner ear. This usually means that the cochlea isn't working effectively. In other words, it is permanent. Conductive deafness means that sound can pass efficiently through the outer and middle ear into the inner ear. A third that I put in is unilateral deafness. Deafness in one ear only, referred to as one-sided hearing loss or single-sided deafness, SSD for short. If the student is comfortable enough, have them sit close to the speaker for maximum intake of visual cues. The instructor should also try to practice avoiding covering their mouths or standing away from the student. Next are the sitting arrangements. Depending on the lesson, if, for instance, they are having a group discussion, it is encouraged for the instructor to have the students sit in a U or circle formation so that the deaf student is able to see the other students' faces and mouths. Most students with hearing loss can speech read to some extent. So always try to remember to face them when you talk, and remember to talk clearly and at a normal pace. If available, use an FM system. The teacher wears a microphone or transmitter, and the student wears the receiver, which amplifies sound. It is also said that students with hearing problems are visual learners, and it is encouraged to use graphics, pictures, and text labels. Now we move on to interpreters. Interpreters have no knowledge of the student's classroom performance or etiology of their deafness. I thought that was interesting because these interpreters are only there to translate. They don't really know the live situation of the student. Some helpful tips when working with an interpreter, which I found interesting as well. For instance, speak directly to the student instead of the interpreter. Refrain from saying, "Can you ask her to?" I feel like I would also have made the same mistake if I did not know anything about how to deal with an interpreter. I think that I would have faced the interpreter and asked him or her the same thing. Not because I mean to be disrespectful, just because I did not know. I was not aware of the harm that it can cause. Next, the interpreter and the teacher will discuss the best place for the interpreter to sit or stand. Also, be cautious of the pace of the interpreter because they will always be a few words behind. Provide them with extra copies of material that will be discussed in class if they need it.
Students who are deaf often have problems and difficulty learning in school. These students have trouble learning in all subject areas, but in particular, they struggle most in reading and mathematical concepts. The reason? Well, deafness causes delays in the development of receptive and expressive communication skills. So these students are going to be a little bit slower than others when communicating, and it takes more time to help these students learn compared to a typical student. As a result, their academic achievement in reading and language arts will be affected unless there are special strategies to accommodate them. Along with academic problems, students who are deaf are more likely to experience negative social-emotional development. Since it is very difficult for them to communicate with others, they often have poor self-concept and are socially isolated from others. This may have an impact on their vocational choices. So for example, they may have trouble finding classes or jobs in the future that deals with communicating with others. These students, they often report feeling isolated, lonely, and unhappy in school as a direct result of not being able to communicate with other children.
Okay, so strategies for teaching deaf students in inclusive classrooms include discussing deafness with your students at the beginning of the year to satisfy their curiosity in a controlled environment. This way, you'll avoid students asking inappropriate or sensitive questions to deaf or hard of hearing students. You, as a teacher, can also learn about deaf culture. Sign language is only one aspect of deaf culture. Deaf culture describes the social beliefs, behaviors, art, literary traditions, history, values, and shared institutions of communities that are affected by deafness and which use sign language as the main means of communication. Further, you can learn basic signs that will come up often, things that you don't need an interpreter for, things like good morning, bathroom, question, homework, help, and a few others. You also should be mindful of closed captions on videos and auditory media that you present to the class. As often as you can, you should try and find things with closed captioning. Live captioning software may also help during lectures. This is where you can speak into a microphone and have the captioning coming up on a screen as the lecture goes.
For educational implications, it is important to know that hearing loss does not affect a person's intellectual ability or ability to learn. There is a common misconception that all students, no matter if they have a disability or not, they are taught in a very similar way. However, students are meant to be taught at different levels depending on their academic levels, and this also goes for deaf students. Deaf students need to be treated different, but not so much that they feel uncomfortable or feel left out. And there's a very thin line, and a teacher needs to know the difference. Deaf students are obtaining the same knowledge hearing students are. They are just doing it a little differently. They need more acknowledgement from the teacher to make sure they are not behind in lectures. And just like there are different types of students, there's different types of deaf students. There are regular deaf students, hard of hearing, students that mouth read, ASL communicators, speaking students, mute students, and students with hearing aids. This goes back to how teachers need to accommodate to each student needs, and some accommodations they could do is favorable sitting, which means that the deaf student is in front of the class or next to the teacher in order for them to communicate with each other and for the student to be able to lip read. Another one is having a note taker for the deaf students, and this involves a hearing classmate taking notes for both themselves and the deaf student, so the deaf student can be able to lip read and not take notes at the same time. The Individual Education Plan or Program, IEP, is a plan that develops to ensure a child with identified disability who is attending an elementary or secondary education institution receives specialized instructions and related services. This IEP program involves the teachers, students, other school staffs, and the student themselves to come look at the needs that they need. It is the teacher's responsibility to understand the type of students they have and what type of teaching they are comfortable with. The individual education plan is how the deaf student is able to communicate their academic achievements through the various teachers and their peers. It basically is a written plan that describes the individual learning of needs a student with disability needs, such as support, aids, accommodations, and modifications that they will be provided to that student.
Finally, do not baby your deaf students. They're capable of doing everything a hearing student can do except for hearing. Be patient and hold them to the same standards that you would hold any of their classmates. They are just as capable as the rest of your students.